Hi there, it's Julia from 10 Square Crafts. Thanks so much for tuning in to this YouTube video. I'm so glad to be back over on the TheAlleyWayStamps YouTube channel, sharing a card I created using the Baby on Board mini stamp set as well as the Bugging Out mini stamp set. I'm starting with a piece of watercolor paper here that's cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, which is the same as the card base that I'll use at the end. This is an A2 size card. I am using my ruler, which is just a little bit wider than that little honey pot shape in the Baby on Board stamp set, and I am just using a pencil to draw some lines. I do plan to stamp a full background, so I wanted to make sure that I had it spaced correctly. Once my lines are drawn, I'm using my anti-static powder tool. This is a homemade tool that I used using cornstarch baby powder, and I put it into a little fabric pouch that I used double-sided tape to stick together, and it works really awesome. Next, I'm going to ink up my honey pot stamp and stamp that all over my background. I'm doing 5 rows of 4, and I plan to heat emboss this using clear embossing powder from WOW. I just repeat this process for the whole card background, and then I heat zap it all at once. You'll see that I actually sprinkle on some of the embossing powder after each row, and that's just to make sure that I got plenty of embossing powder on each row before the ink had a chance to dry. You probably don't need to do this, but I just wanted to be sure. Next, I'm going to turn my stamp upside down so that the flat part of the stamp, which is usually like the back of the stamp, is facing out. I'm going to do an ink smooshing technique here, and I thought that it would be kind of cool if the ink smooshing were sort of the same shape as the honey pot, so that's what I'm doing. I'm using 4 colors of distress ink for this project, a combination of some pinks and purples. The colors that I'm using are Spun Sugar, Victorian Velvet, Milled Lavender, and Seedless Preserves. And all I'm doing is inking up the back of that stamp, spritzing a little water on it, and then stamping it onto my background. You can see there that it creates a fun, loose-looking watercolor look, and that it's kind of cool that the smooshing technique is the similar shape as the honey pot that I'm using. I repeat this exact same process for all of the honey pots in a completely random order, and then I even go back in with the spun sugar at the end because I felt like it was a little bit too light compared to the other colors, so you'll see how that looks at the end. Next, I'm moving on to stamping my little bee. This bee is from the Bugging Out stamp set. I love this little guy. I used him in a card a few weeks ago, a little shaker card. I'm using the digital SVG files that I pre-cut using my Silhouette portrait machine, and then it's easy to stamp on the images. To color them in, I'm using Spectrum Noir markers. For the yellow part, I'm using OR1 and CT2. And then for the little black bodies, I'm using IG1 and IG6 to create the little the black blend. I find that when you want to color black, that it's best to not do a flat matte black because that tends to look very flat. So I use 2 shades of gray, and it creates more of a dimensional look. I use the IG6 and IG10 for the bodies, and then I used IG1 for the wings. I didn't want to leave those stark white, so this just adds, again, a little touch of dimension. Next, I'm moving on to continue with my front panel now that it's had a chance to dry. You can see all of those honey pots are colored or smooshed. I wanted to stamp the little yum stamp that comes in the Baby on Board stamp set, so I'm just stamping it into a few of the honey jars, not all of them, just because I didn't want the card to be too busy, and I thought it's kind of cool to have a little bit of difference between all of the rows. Like, none are really exactly the same at all. I'm using the VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp these little yums, and in this case I didn't bother heat embossing them just because I didn't feel like it was necessary. Next, I'm going to stamp my sentiment. This says "Oh Sweet," which is some words that come in the Baby on Board stamp set. Most of the stamps that I'm using today are from the Baby on Board stamp set except for the bee. I stamped that onto vellum using the VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and then heat embossed that using clear embossing powder from WOW. As a finishing touch for my little bees, I added some clear wink of Stella. I then trimmed down my sentiment strip, and I'm going to adhere one of the little bees directly on it, almost like he's pulling it in the sky. I want to show you a little trick how I position large panels on the front of card bases. I perpetually stick things on sideways, so I found that this is really helpful when I'm adhering a front panel or a large panel onto the front of my card base. I'm just using my Stamp-A-Majig at the top, and then what I'll do is I'll line up that top left corner and everything lines up perfectly. I'm going to use clear foam tape to adhere down all of my little bees, as well as there's a small piece behind the greeting there. One little trick that I like to use is to stick down a piece of tape so that I can stick all the backings onto it. This way they're not all stuck to everything and I can kind of control them a little bit more easily. I just throw out that tape once I'm done. I go ahead and stick down all the rest of my bees, and then as a finishing touch, add some black gel pen to their eyes to make sure that they pop, and then my card is done. Thank you so much for tuning into this YouTube video. I hope that I've inspired you to play around with some of your stamp sets and maybe turn them upside down or backwards. I'll be back again soon with another card for the Alleyway Stamps, and in the meantime, have a great day. Bye!